Welcome. Welcome again to Lectures on Size. This is the second part of the Lectures on Size. I think that this is the fourth lecture. You'll have to check the table that I created to organize this a little bit. But I think this is the fourth lecture for Lecture Exam 4. Take a look. Do make sure you're following things. But this is the second part of looking at size. And as we take a look at size and as we considered it, we said that as things get bigger, surface area does not increase as fast as volume. That's what we were learning about. Well, now what we want to do is take a look at what happens then when size is reduced. And so the opposite would be true. If you take anything, make it smaller, keeping all the same proportions, in fact, the surface area increases proportionately as things get smaller. Remember we said surface area does not increase proportionately as volume gets larger. So as we make things smaller, they proportionately have more and more surface area. And we said that one of the effects of that is that young children, infants, have so much surface area compared to their volume that they lose an awful lot of heat compared to an adult person. So we were looking at a picture of a woman with a baby, and she was dressed as if the weather was pretty warm, and the baby was in an encasement, a way of hauling little children, that looked really nicely bundled, as if it must have been freezing outside. And the difference we explained, or I explained, is that the smaller person, the child, the infant, had a much higher surface to volume ratio. So surface to volume ratios go down as things get bigger. And I was comparing going from a baseball to a basketball. And now we're looking at the reverse. So as we make things ever smaller, keeping all the same proportions, we'll see that in fact things and the consequences are really quite different and dramatic. There's a number of things that are explained if you understand that principle, that surface area increases proportionally as we make things smaller. Okay? So the effect is that things that are really small, and I'm talking about insects and really small animals of various sorts, there's small worms, for example. Some of the other phyla that we didn't really look at are also pretty small organisms. When we take a look at their life and the way they interact with our world, it turns out that being small has dramatic consequences. So let's take a look. So here's what we said. As things increase, the mass increases faster. As they get bigger, mass increases faster than surface area. And so what we're saying is now half as long is only an eighth as heavy. And as size decreases, the surface to volume ratios increase. So we were taking a potato and we were cutting it up so that we could cook it faster. By cutting up the potato, we then created higher surface to volume ratios. All right, well, it turns out that the properties of our world are affected by your size. How about this? Have you ever had trouble getting out of a swimming pool because the water was so sticky? Imagine that the water isn't water, but it's honey or molasses or something else very thick that you would have trouble emerging from. And by the way, I have absolutely no idea who this person is. This is someone's photo that was posted on the internet, and so it's something always to bear in mind when you post a bunch of photos of yourself. Well, you don't have trouble getting out of a swimming pool because the water's sticky. But what if you're really small and you have very high surface to volume ratios? It turns out that for some animals, getting stuck on water is a death trap. Water, I said, is sticky? Well, let's think about that. Are there adhesive properties of water? Well, what you're looking at right here is a drip of water coming off of a faucet. And there, pointed out by the arrow, is the little extension, the string of water going down to the droplet. You've probably seen water strung out like this if you ever turn on the faucet very, very slowly, or if you're shutting things down. There's a drip. In fact, as you think about the fact that water is sticky, think about this. You go in and you take a shower, probably took off all your clothes, and then when you're done with your shower, you turn off the water. Why do you need a towel? What's a towel for? Why is there water still on you? You turned off the water. And the answer is because water is sticky, and water is going to stick to you. And so what we do with a towel is try to get that water sticking to your skin to instead stick to the towel. Well, if we think about people that go fishing, what they often do in fly fishing, it's called dry fly fishing, is that you cast out a lure that sits on the surface of the water. And that's imitating this. And here's a moth stuck to the surface of the water. Now, way back in 2011 was the last time we had a great big cicada outbreak, 2011. And I don't know if that was the 17-year cicada. It might have been. It's a whole different story. But on my pond, the pond is surrounded by oak trees, and there's an awful lot of cicadas that came out. Well, the pond's about 5 acres, and the distance across the pond is about the length of a football field. Turns out that when these cicadas would launch themselves out of my oak trees, if they launch themselves towards another oak tree nearby, that's how they're spreading the species. That's a normal, good adaptive thing to do. But if they were very ambitious and they decided to launch themselves towards a tree on the other side of the pond, well, it turns out they aren't good enough to fly that distance. And so on their way to the other side of the pond, they'd fall onto the pond. And when they did, they stuck to the surface, much like this moth stuck to the surface. And then they made things even worse for themselves. As they stuck to the surface, they would beat their wings against the water. So the effect was to attract all sorts of predators. At that time in my pond, there were bass that would come over and just suck them right up. If the bass were slower, the pond turtles would come over. And in that particular year, in the summer of 2011, I had a rare duck on my pond. And that duck and the turtles literally would race to get the cicadas stuck on the surface. And again, because the cicadas were stuck on the surface and trying to get free, they would flap their wings and essentially advertise the fact that there was an easy meal to come right over and get it. The point was, I watched that summer, no kidding, hundreds of cicadas launch themselves over the pond and then fall into the water. The duck that was on my pond literally was filled up. It literally, I don't think, could eat anymore on most of these days. It was about a month of this activity. Well, the point was that these animals are so small and their surface area is so high that when they hit the water, the adhesive properties of water stick to them, they can't get free from the water, and they die. Here's an example of an animal that we have around us. It's a water strider, and what's really neat is that water striders have their legs spread out. They're distributing their weight over a very broad area. The ends of their legs are a big broad contact, and they don't break the film of the water, the surface tension of the water. And so they're actually standing on the water. And what you can see is these dark patches here are places where the water is literally dented in, where their feet are pushing down on the water film. Here we can see in some other pictures of these water striders, bottom left and top right, you can clearly see the places in the water that are pushed in, dimpled down, and these animals are striding on top of the water. It's really, really neat. So the point is, these animals, with their really small size, have a very, very high surface to volume ratio, low mass, so low that it doesn't break the film, and a large area of contact, so they don't break through. Interestingly, some of the same principles that these water striders use, you might have used or you might know about if you've ever seen or walked on rather thin ice over a pond or, well, probably a pond or a lake. And what will happen when you're walking over a pond or a lake is that if you put most of your weight on 1 foot or 2, especially if your feet are close together, you will be concentrating your weight in one small spot, and you might break through the ice. But in fact, if the ice is starting to break apart and you're really in trouble, if you spread yourself out very, very wide, you might not break through the ice. You might distribute your weight over such a broad area that in any one spot, there's not enough pressure to break through the ice. That literally is what these Jareds are doing with liquid water, not ice, in that they're spreading out their legs and distributing their light body weight over a very large area, and they aren't breaking through the water film. Here's another one of the problems of being really small with high surface to volume ratios. Wind. Sometimes if people have gone on camping trips, you might know this already. This is one of those times when I usually call on the class, and a couple people in the class already know this. But if you're plagued by mosquitoes or flies, if it's a pretty windy day, that will be less of an issue because the mosquitoes and flies have a great deal of trouble navigating in high winds. So I remember some times when my family was camping around Lake Superior, and it was a stormy time, and goodness, we had trouble pitching our tent, but we didn't have any problems with mosquitoes or flies. So for you, did you ever just stay home, just from school, because it was too windy? Well, that is true for mosquitoes. Mosquitoes tend to stay home on really windy days. Why? Because they have very, very high surface to volume ratios. And you know I mean size matters because I made it blink right there. Well, here's something else that happens, and I'm so sorry that we weren't able to have our lab of chordate day when we bring in salamanders. Now, this is a spotted salamander from probably southern Illinois, also in Missouri. These guys, trying to think of something that's about the size of this for you. Well, they'd fit on your hand. This animal would fit on your hand if you made your palm up. It would fit in one hand. So from the tip of the nose here to about the back legs might be about 4 inches or so in length, and another maybe 3 inches for the tail. Well, these animals, being small, like earthworms, which they love to eat, have very high surface to volume ratios. And sometimes when I've held them to show them off, they have a slimy skin, and that slime is an antimicrobial protection. It also keeps the skin wet for respiration. So when I hold them, all I'm really doing is keeping my hand out flat, and they're resting on my hand. I don't restrict their motion. I don't grab them in any way. And that means that sometimes they just get really excited and they'll scamper away and might go right off my hand and fall on the floor. And when they fall on the floor, as has happened with live earthworms, my classes gasp. They think I've done something horrible, and they think I've probably seriously hurt my salamander or the worms. If you think about that, if we drop them from about the bench top height or your kitchen counter height to the floor, that's about 30 times their length. What would happen if you fell from the height that's about 30 times your length and you hit the ground? Well, you'd probably be killed. Okay? Fall off that building. It would be very rare circumstances that you wouldn't be killed. Just to tell you a little side story, when I was well, really about where you were at in my first couple of years of college, I was one of the guys that goes around in the summer in a van and sells ice cream to kids. And so I'm selling the ice cream out of the side of the van. And as I'm working with the kids and taking their money and giving them ice cream, out of the corner of my eye, I see a squirrel fall from a tree, maybe 30 feet or more up. It was a really tall oak tree in Peoria, Illinois. And it hit the sidewalk. And I looked right over where it hit. And I thought, oh, that's going to be horrible. There's going to be a dead squirrel, or it's going to be in horrible suffering. And these kids will see it, and this whole thing's going to be horrible. And I look over, and the squirrel ran away. That squirrel probably dropped 30 feet at least. And it hit the sidewalk. And there wasn't a splat. Instead, the squirrel landed and ran away. And if I drop worms onto concrete, or salamanders onto concrete, these small ones, they typically are fine. Now there's a way, probably a salamander could hit its head, that it wouldn't be so fine, but it probably wouldn't die. Why? And the answer is because they're really small. They don't have a lot of mass. And when they hit the surface, they spread that mass out over a large proportional area for them. And so there's not a lot of really strong impact for any one part. Okay? It's an interesting principle of thinking of when you get really small, you have relatively small mass, and you have a large surface area for the splat, if you want to think about it that way. I remember once listening to advice if people were parachuting, jumping out of planes. And one of the bits of advice was that if none of your parachutes open up and you're in a free fall and you're going to hit the ground, they said, well, one thing you could try is spread your arms and legs out as wide as possible and try to hit the ground, spreading that force over the greatest area. And then my favorite part, and hope that you only break all your arms and legs. And I thought, there's lots of things you can do in your free time, but maybe this is something that I don't want to do in my free time, because I don't ever want to hope that when I screw up, I only break all my arms and legs. But again, it's about spreading out a force over a really, really big area. So here's something else to consider. We talked already about going from small to large. Now we've just talked about going from large to small. Pretty regularly on nature films and even in some books, I'll see someone who's marveling at the amazing achievements of insects. Remember those leaf cutter ants that we were looking at? I think we were looking at that haul those little pieces of leaves around. Yeah, we looked at that. I think it was one of the first lectures here on movement. And I said, actually, it turns out that if that ant was the size of you, it wouldn't have what would appear to be superhuman powers. It wouldn't be able to lift cars. Those things might proportionally be the truth, that if you looked at a little ant, what it lifts compared to its body weight would be like a person doing those things. But in fact, if you built an ant the size of a person, because of this surface to volume thing, and we're going to explore this, that animal would collapse. Its legs would break. Its legs would not be sufficient to hold it up. Now, this is a different kind of a calculation. It's going to be based on exactly that same cube dice scenario that I talked about in the lecture just before this. So let's play this out. Here's one thing, instead of lifting things, you'll hear, if a grasshopper is the size of a person, could we make this grasshopper size of a person jump the length of a football field? Okay. Nope, wouldn't happen. The grasshopper couldn't even stand up, and let's look at why the physics about that is true. Yes, it would need crutches or something like that. So we're going to go back to that cube. We said a cube has 6 sides. That is what cubes do. And each measurement, length, width, and height, are all the same. Okay. So we said there's a side of 1, we can make that 1 square inch. And so if it's the volume of the cube, it would be 1 cubic inch. Okay. But now, instead of the entire surface area, what we're going to consider is only the side of the cube that's resting on the surface. So if we had this dice, and if you looked at the dice, and if it was a 6, I don't know if you know this, but the side opposite the 6, I'm just curious, do you know what number that is? Well, if you have dice, you can go look. The answer is it's 1. And the side that's opposite 3 is 4. And the side that's opposite 5, well, I bet you can figure that one out. Okay, so the side that would be opposite 6, the part that's resting on the tabletop, that we're going to call the footprint. And it literally is like a footprint. It's, for your feet, it's the part in contact, right, with mud or sand or whatever it is you're standing that would allow you to leave a clear footprint. Okay. And so what we can figure out and calculate here is the weight over 1 footprint. And in this case, we're looking at a cube. It would be 1 cubic inch over 1 square inch, right? Because one side is 1 square inch. And now if we take a look at the larger cube, this one was the side 2, here you can see, if this was, imagine this is tile and you're putting tile down on a bathroom floor or kitchen floor. Here's 4 pieces of tile. That's right, that would be 4 square inches, because each one of these is 1 square inch, so 4 square inches. So there's 4 square inches of footprint. But how much mass is over those 4 square inches? And the mass is 8 times as great, right? Because this is 8 dice, or 8 cubic inches. And so now we have 8 cubic inches over 4. So that's twice as much. But we don't need to make this any more complicated than it already is. So there's your weight over each footprint. Here's what it's really like. Look, we increase the size of the cube, and now every cube on the bottom has somebody on its shoulders. Okay, so guess what? Each footprint down here now supports twice as much. I don't know if you have ever held somebody on your back like this who's the same mass as you. But if you did, if they were completely supported on your back, you know that your feet would be experiencing a much greater mass coming down onto your feet and your footprints. In fact, you would have doubled the amount of mass per footprint, just like this, right? So if we took off this top layer, all of these guys would just be sitting there with 1 cubic inch over 1 square inch. But by making this cube bigger, now we have 2 on each square inch. Well, what about 3? Same thing. Look, each of these cubes on the bottom has 2 additional on the shoulder. So I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but could you support 2 people your size, both sitting on your shoulders? And the answer is probably not. That's a lot. In fact, it would be really dangerous. And most of the time when we screw around with this kind of stuff, we do it in a swimming pool. Because then when you fall down or fall off, well, then it's not so consequential, I hope, unless you're near the edge of the pool, and that could be trouble. In fact, when you do this in a swimming pool, the normal way that I've seen it done is that when I'm going to get somebody on my back, I get down in the water really low, keeping just my head above the water, and then they get on. So they're still being supported. They are being supported by the water a little bit, and it makes it a little easier for them to get on. And then as I rise up and they emerge completely from the water, then I'm supporting all of their mass on my shoulders. And it's a little easier way to do it. Well, as we make these cubes greater and greater, here now side 5, of course, each block now has 4 on its shoulders. Okay, that I hope is just clear. We don't even have to do the mass to surface ratio. Here's a cube 5 units wide. Each footprint now has to support 5 times the weight that one cube would have to support. Okay. So if we made a grasshopper as big as you, it depends on the grasshopper, and it would depend on the size of you, but we could just say, for good rounded purposes, that a grasshopper would have to increase its length by 50 times. Okay? How would that change the footprint? So here is the simple formula, and that is the footprint area would increase by 50 by 50, and the volume would increase by 50 by 50 by 50. So the volume would be 50 times greater than the area of the footprint, proportionally. That means this would be like you with 49 people sitting on your shoulders. And that, by any calculation I've ever seen, would be impossible for a person to do. So here's one of these really rounded, we call them hand-waving principles. But if you've ever done bench presses, leg presses, so you're on some kind of Nautilus machine or something and you've done leg presses. I don't know if you have, so if you weigh 150 pounds, could you leg press 750 pounds? And the answer is possibly. I actually did that. I weighed about 150 pounds in high school. And I remember leg pressing one time, but fully leg pressing 750 pounds. And so I was able, without, screwing up my legs, I was able to leg press 5 times my body weight. What we generally know in anatomy is bones and other kinds of connective tissues, so tendons and ligaments, they would tend to fail somewhere between 5 and 10 times the normal load. Whatever they normally are experiencing, now hit them with about 5 to 10 times, and they may be breaking, especially if things aren't lined up perfectly. Okay? So, a grasshopper 50 times longer than normal not only couldn't jump a football field, it couldn't even stand up. Its legs would be crushed. You would have a dead grasshopper. Wouldn't look like that. Would have crushed legs. So here is the interesting part. And this is the part where it makes going to the zoo now more interesting. Or just looking at pictures online. What we've said is, if you take a grasshopper and you make it 50 times bigger, well, its legs couldn't support it. So does that mean we don't have any animals on Earth that are more than 5 times the size of a grasshopper? Well, no. We have plenty, especially those dinosaurs we were looking at. So how do big dinosaurs, how do elephants today manage to walk around on land being so big and so massive? And the answer is they have disproportionately larger legs. So if you had a really small version of something that looked like an elephant, you would have unusually small legs. And now when we look at elephants, we'll see that their legs are massive. They have very big footprints. So what we want to do is compare an elephant shrew and an elk and an elephant, and they all start with E. And I don't know why, but it seemed fun. So let's take a look. That's an elephant shrew, that's an elk, and that's an elephant. Now look at the relative diameter of the legs compared to the body. These are kind of little stilt-like things. Just like we got a big mass here, and then blink, 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 got these little legs. Now over here in the elk, no, they've got a little more massiveness here. Okay, they're a little more significant legs. And now finally look at the elephant. They got just columns. Okay, this is like some kind of Roman columns of buildings that are supporting a great big massive building here. Yes, elephants walk and bend their legs, but when they're most restful and it's most peaceful, their legs are straight, and they have very, very big feet. In fact, when we go sometimes to the Field Museum in Chicago, if you have, they have two really big mounted elephants there. Gosh, I think they're over 100 years old now. And you can't touch them, but you can get pretty close to them. You can get about a meter away from the feet. And I have my students put their hands near the feet and spread their hands apart. And I don't know what size your dinner plates are, but if you looked at a big dinner plate, the footprint of an elephant is much bigger than just a basic dinner plate. So it might be 14, 16 inches in diameter. So what we're saying is the mass grew, the footprint kept up with the mass, or was close to it. Okay. Now, Dr. Cardong, my colleague, who's no longer with us, and that makes me very, very sad. But Dr. Cardong had a leading textbook, still does, in comparative anatomy. And to make this point about the impact of size and to think about, well, then how does the leg change? He compared these three lizard-like critters, and he looked at the same bone in their legs. Right here's the same bone that pulls out from their legs. And he's drawn each bone to the same scale. So the length of each bone is the same, but of course this would be a much bigger bone than the little one over here, and this would be intermediate in size. So he's taken the little bone and drawn it here to the same length as the big bone is here. And what you notice is how the diameter of these bones changes. Here we've got a very thick bone, and here's a relatively thin bone here. Okay, that's the point. In the smaller sized animal, it could get by with a smaller footprint and a thinner bone. But as this animal scaled up, its footprints and the stout nature of these supporting bones have to get thicker and thicker. Okay, so there's a description pretty much of what I just said. So, when we think about being big, we think about the tremendously large footprints of sauropod dinosaurs. Flat footprints like this. These animals did not move quickly. I've actually stood in these footprints in western Colorado and Utah, and they're big. Garbage can lid, pretty close to garbage can lid size of these critters. These animals moved rather slowly compared to the very fast abilities of, gosh, think about a rabbit, okay? These guys didn't run like rabbits. They were slow to get going. They were slow to stop. Lots of inertia. But the big pillar kinds of legs that we see in elephants. And now the interesting point is, well, is that the biggest animal that we've ever seen on Earth? And the answer is no. Right now, to my knowledge, the biggest animal that has ever lived is alive today, and it's a great blue whale. Well, how is that possible? If this is a real problem of getting bigger and bigger and the footprints can't keep up, how is it that we have a gigantic animal as a great blue whale? And I hope you've realized that it's in water. And so undoubtedly you've had a chance to swim before and feel the buoyancy of water. That water can support your weight. You can float. And down here, this animal doesn't have buoyancy. Hush, Zoe. Zoe wants dinner. This animal doesn't have any buoyancy, it's walking on land. Here's a diagram kind of making that point. This is some of the largest sauropods that we know about. It's just amazing size and proportions. But again, the leg is very straight. Proportionally, it's a huge footprint. The leg as a cross section compared to the body is very, very big. This isn't the kind of little splinter-like legs that you see on ants, for example. So now we move to a different direction. Now we consider some other aspects, which is, okay, animals are big and animals are small, and as they get big, their proportions have to change because of basic physics. That's what we're saying. And after we've said and done all this, what are the advantages of being really, really big? And as you can guess, we're going to talk about what are the advantages of being very, very small. And I'm so very sorry that we aren't together to have these discussions. If you think about what's the advantage of being very, very large, I don't know what comes to mind. I'd love to discuss this with you. Here's some notes. Here's advantages of being very, very small. So you tell me, instead of saying which is the advantage, you tell me. I thought I'd try it this way for you at home or wherever you're at. Tell me as we go through these, would it be better to be big or small? So on an island, when resources are scarce, would it be an advantage to be big or small? And I hope as you're thinking about this, you realize that, well, if you can't get enough to eat, because it takes 5 years of eating before you're sexually mature. So he's still looking for dinner. Sorry about that. If you can't get enough to eat, so if you're a deer and you're going to have to eat or something for 5 years, can't get enough to eat, you may never reproduce. But what if you reproduce at a smaller size? Well, then there might be enough resources for you to reproduce when you're smaller. So, which is better when resources are scarce? Smaller size is usually the answer. And it turns out that being reduced in size, so having a smaller version of a species, is called miniaturization. And we have all sorts of examples of this. I'll show you some in just a minute. But miniaturization occurs on islands, and it's happened with deer, it's happened with elephants that we know about. It may have even happened in humans. Okay. So if you, for some reason, there's going to be an advantage to have more critters for a given space. So how many critters can we get on a football field? So if we had only a football field area to live on, would it be better that the critters are big or small? And I hope you understand it'd be better to be small. So if you just think about it, compare elephants and ants. Which one is going to be more abundant living in an area the size of a football field? And clearly, by many magnitudes, thousands more ants than elephants. Elephants eating grasses, but still because they're big, they need to eat and have a lot more food than ants. Also because they're endotherms and homeotherms, there's all sorts of other issues with elephants. But nonetheless, population density can be higher for a given unit area, like a football field, if you're small. I already mentioned this life cycle, which is that if you're smaller, then and you reproduce at a smaller size, then you don't have to have as much food to grow to be large. You might be able to get by with reproducing when you're small and you're not very old. You might be younger when you reproduce. Exploring different habitats. So what what's interesting is when you're thinking about these, think about insects. So if you're really, really small, you can live on a leaf. If you're really, really small, you can live on the petiole of a leaf. You can live high up in the trees. But if you're an elephant or elk, you're pretty much going to be limited to good, firm foundations like solid earth. So, being small also has the advantage of being able to live in more habitats. Likewise, with insects, think about all the ways they can move about. They can burrow into the ground, so they can tunnel into the loose dirt underneath a log right now out in the woods. They can walk around on the surfaces. They can walk around on surfaces that clearly wouldn't support a rabbit. And they can fly. So insects have a great deal of mobility. But what's interesting is, although they can move in more ways, they tend not to move as great of a distance. So insects, and there are some, like monarchs, that seem to migrate over great distances. Generally speaking, insects don't move over such big distances, but larger animals can cover more distance. So they're more mobile, but it's not that they can go as far as bigger animals. And so this is the fly great distances, and if you look at the grand champions of this, so Arctic terns are a type of bird that my wife and I got to see in Iceland. They were all over the place. In fact, it's some neat things if I ever get a chance to show you, because they die of bomia. They think that, I guess, we're in their territory. They didn't have nests, but I think they thought it was their place. And so you just stand there, and they wouldn't actually hit your head, but they'd come really, really close. Well, Arctic terns, some of them, will fly all the way from the North to the South Pole and then back in the course of a year. So that's a pretty great distance. Another bird that I saw in New Zealand were the albatross, the great albatross, that are able to soar for years at a time, covering tens of thousands of miles. Well, I mentioned to you miniaturization. And if you've ever been to the Florida Keys, and you have to watch for this, you have to know where to stop and what island. You'll see some signs along the road. But on the Florida Keys, which is a series of islands on the southern part of Florida, deer have made their way there, and resources are limited, and these are adult stag deer. Now, you are not supposed to come up and touch them like you're seeing people do. And goodness, that one in front of the car, I hope that's a parked car on a driveway, because the greatest threat to these deer is accidents with people. So you can drive around on one island where they're abundant. They're called key deer, and there's a preserve, but that preserve borders on a subdivision, a whole series of hundreds of houses. And if you drive really slowly on those streets, you'll see, well, I do this regularly with students, and we regularly see probably about 5 deer. You can get within about 20, 30 feet of them. They're pretty tame. The most important thing is don't do anything that could hurt them, and don't corner them, don't try to touch them, you don't feed them. But nonetheless, these are miniature deer. And we think that the natural reason that they're small is because they're on an island with limited resources. So my point is, here's an advantage of being small. Well, there's an interesting Blackburn connection. In fact, one that I didn't know about until 1990. So I came to Blackburn in 1989, and in 1990 was my first graduation. And at that graduation, we gave Dr. Bill Klimstra a distinguished Blackburn alumnus award. And so he came and spoke. Well, I was at Carbondale, where I got my bachelor's and my master's in zoology, and Dr. Klimstra was the head of the wildlife department at Carbondale. Now, the wildlife department at Carbondale is world famous, especially their deer studies. And Dr. Klimstra was just a giant. In fact, the truth is, I don't know if I ever talked to him. I was so scared. I had such respect for Dr. Klimstra. Just to add on to this, one of the misunderstandings that people have is they think, well, okay, if you want to go to medical school, well, you better be a really good student and get great grades. Well, if you wanted to go to graduate school in Dr. Klimstra's graduate program in wildlife biology at Carbondale, you had to be as good of a student as the pre-meds. Oh my goodness, wildlife biology was not for people who weren't strong students. You had to be a strong student. And Dr. Klimstra ran a very good serious program. Well, we didn't give a distinguished Blackburn College alumnus award to somebody who didn't graduate. We gave the award to someone who did from Blackburn College. And Dr. Klimstra graduated from Blackburn College. I had no idea. And Dr. Klimstra did his PhD on key deer. So how about that, pulling this whole thing together? I don't know what this person's doing. Maybe they're a wildlife biologist. I hope. I hope maybe they're applying some treatment for this little deer, but you can see the body proportions. They just look odd when you see the key deer. Here's an example of some of the miniaturized hippos and elephants that we have found on islands before. So this showing you, imagine a full-grown elephant that size. And imagine a little baby hippo like this. And there are pygmy hippos. Turns out through captive breeding, people doing weird stuff, you can actually select for tiny horses. And I don't know if any of you have seen or learned more about this. I haven't. What people do in domestic production of animals is impressive, but it's not the best reflection of natural biology. It is artificial selection, but nonetheless, you can select for smaller and smaller size. This is a naturally occurring, it's probably a chameleon, by the little hump on his back and his eyes and the way he grips the fingernail, but you can see how small that critter is. So again, why might we see miniaturization on islands? Well, for one thing, you probably could have more places to live. There might be places in between bark or underneath smaller twigs or leaves, or even amongst gravel. You might be able to survive if you're really, really small, and it's an island with very few places to live. And of course, as I said, the life cycle can be faster, and that means they're probably reproducing at a smaller size. So all in all, the point is size matters. And we've looked at it from many different angles here, and I hope you found this interesting. All right, the last thing left for us is the next, I hope I can do it all in one lecture, on reproductive biology. And so reproductive biology will be where we end the semester. Lots of different topics to consider there, and I'll see you there next time. One more thing to tell you. I forgot I had this slide in here. On April 22nd of this year, in 2020, it'll be the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Now, all of us are caught up, as we should be, I think, paying attention to the pandemic. It is a threat to the health of so many people. It's been such a very serious, lethal disease now for thousands of American citizens and tens of thousands of people across the earth. So, in every way, we need to pay attention. But we can't forget about all the other problems going on. And Earth Day was an attempt to draw the world's attention, at least on one day, to the many different problems. In the 1970s, there were a series of laws that were passed that protected the quality of air and of water. Recycling programs were increased, and we really started paying attention more to the environment. Now, of course, with global warming, we have a new major problem. The little trivia is that I was at the very first Earth Day. I was 12 years old, and I'm 62 now. I was in elementary school, I don't know, 12, I think I was in 6th grade. Yeah, I think that's right. And I was able to go with my older brother to Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, where we were enjoying the very first Earth Day. And it's been something that I think is important ever since. So I hope that you have a chance to think about something other than COVID, and it should be a great concern, and to reflect again on all the ways that we can pay attention to our home the blue marble in the sky. In any case, I'll see you next on reproductive biology, the next lecture. Bye-bye.